Please start the recording. Perfect. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the YRBiz webinar series. My name is Karen Dubois. I'm your host and MC for today's session. We are really excited to have a fantastic guest speaker with us here today, John Stackhouse, Senior Vice President from Royal Bank Canada. But before we dive in, I'd like to ask Jennifer Banakis from the Regional Municipality of York to say a few words of welcome. Jennifer?
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Banakis. I am a Policy and Project Development Specialist with Economic Strategy at the Regional Municipality of York. Today's event is the 9th in a series of webinars designed to provide a roadmap to post-COVID economic recovery. At this time, I'd like to thank the Newmarket and Vaughan Chambers of Commerce and the York Region Business Coalition, who continue to partner with us to develop and deliver this webinar series. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to today's presenters and to Karen Dubois for organizing this event. As Karen mentioned, we are joined today by John Stackhouse, Senior Vice President of RBC. John will share key insights from RBC's recent reports regarding market trends and opportunities for small businesses. Small businesses are a critical piece to our local economy, and this topic is very timely as many continue to navigate operating and adjusting their businesses during these challenging times. York Region is home to 4 provincially funded small business enterprise centers who provide free support to both new startups and existing small businesses in their local communities. I would encourage all entrepreneurs and small businesses to reach out to your local center to learn more about these free services and the support they can provide to you. I'll provide a link to the website where you'll be able to find all their contact information in the chat box shortly. Thank you all once again for joining us today. It's back over to you, Karen.
Great, thanks so much, Jennifer. Before we get started, I just wanted to touch on a few housekeeping issues. So today's session is being recorded, and we will make the link available to all the attendees afterwards. So if you want copies of any materials referenced, that will be coming out afterwards. The chat and the Q&A functions for this session are open. And we would encourage you to use them to send questions, add comments, share your own stories. We're going to touch on quite a wide range of different topics today. And so we really look forward to engaging with you. Please don't be shy and use the Q&A. And with that, I'm so excited to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. John Stackhouse. As I mentioned, he's Senior Vice President of RBC. And from all its travels across the country and around the world, he advises business leaders on emerging trends in Canada's economy. Near and dear to my heart, he focuses on technological change and innovation, and more importantly, how to navigate the new economy so people can thrive in the age of disruption. Prior to the pandemic, that had a whole different meaning, but certainly we are in a brand new normal as we continue to navigate through these uncharted waters. I think it's amazing that John spent 25 years at the Globe and Mail. He was editor-in-chief of the Report of Business and a fascinating foreign correspondence in India, and has interviewed prominent world leaders and figures including Vladimir Putin, Kofi Annan, and Benazir Bhutto. So he has a lot of deep understanding of national and international affairs. He also is the host of RBC's Disruptors podcast, and has a number of books that are published. So he has a whole lot of knowledge and insight to share with us, and that's about as much of the time I want to take talking about it and get John to share his thoughts. So John, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Great. Well, Karen, thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you all for sparing your valuable time for this conversation. I really do hope it is a conversation. I'll start off with some insights that we think we've been able to gather at RBC, talking to clients of all sizes, but particularly small business clients across the country, and share some thoughts that we've been developing with those clients, but also with governments on what we need to do as a country to get out of this valley that we're in, but to build a small business-led recovery, which we're genuinely passionate about. If you didn't see my CEO, Dave Mackay, speak about this in the Globe and Mail a couple of weeks ago, I'm sure we can circulate the article with you, but he said quite emphatically, this is a small business recession, and we need small business to lead us out of it. So let's develop a plan for that. And that's what I want to share with you largely today. I thought it was interesting when Dave was asked, what's the one thing Canada should do or focus on in the next 2 years? If you could just pick one thing as CEO of Royal Bank, what would it be? And he said it would be helping Canadian small business go digital and develop the digital savvy. So I hope that can be a good part of our conversation. Karen mentioned a podcast that I get to host called Disruptors. If you're a podcast listener, I would recommend it to you because we try to share conversations. It's not about us at RBC, it's about what technology can do for you and for the country. We've got one coming out next week on artificial intelligence, and so what business operators should be thinking about with AI. The next one after that is on 5G and what opportunities may lie there for you. So I hope you find it useful and also feel welcome to be part of that conversation. Let me step back for a moment and just reflect on what we've been through in 7 months. It feels in some ways like 7 decades or 7 years. It's hard to believe it's only 7 months. I think I was invited to this session after we published a report in June called Small Business Big Pivot. And I hope you've had a chance to see it. We're going to update it this fall, but the core of it is still very much true, that this is a small business economic crisis, and there's a chance here for a really big pivot that we all need to get behind. That's going to be important for all Canadians. But before I get into what that can look like, I think it's worth reflecting a bit on what we've been through. In March and April, 150,000 Canadian businesses closed. They didn't just kind of slow down, they closed. 150,000, that's about 1 in 5 Canadian enterprises. And while we've seen some good recovery through the summer, housing sales way up, jobs showing spotty but decent gains, consumer spending now at levels ahead of last year and all better than we might have expected in June, and so has SME growth been from June. It's come back better than we had anticipated. But we all know, and it's worth reminding the public, that it's been uneven, it's not stable, and both literally and metaphorically, we all know winter is coming. The next number of months are going to be challenging in all sorts of ways that we need to be mindful of and plan for. When we talk about the small business crisis, and I get to talk to government and business groups and community groups about the country, across the country, I always stress it's a small business crisis, but it's a Canadian crisis because the two are very much interlinked. This matters to all Canadians. 44% of Canadians who work in the private sector work for firms with 100 or fewer employees. That is the main engine of the Canadian economy, but also of Canadian employment. And when we talk about recovery and Build Back Better and all these lofty ideas, it's really about helping small business get back on your feet and really pull us along. Small business of 100 or fewer employees accounted for nearly 60% of the job losses between February and April. 1.6 million jobs were lost in small firms. That is almost double the rate of small firm, not medium-sized firm, job loss in the Great Recession. The Great Recession was in many ways a mid-sized corporate and big corporate crisis. Of course, small business was impacted, but one of the fundamental differences is that this crisis is definitely small business primarily. And yeah, we've seen some rebound. 70% of the job losses that I mentioned in the spring have come back, but we're still down nearly 500,000 jobs and the gap is larger among small firms than big firms. And when we think about the recovery, it's important to think about how did that happen? Because it wasn't just a coincidence. Well, Canadian small business largely operates on very thin margins. You all know this. I don't think we quite appreciate on the sidelines or in the policy world how challenging it is for most Canadian entrepreneurs. They're not sitting on bags of cash or liquidity. So when you lose a couple of weeks of business, your liquidity, your buffer's gone. And that's what we saw in March and in April. Small business also tends to, in this country, have higher fixed costs than we see in other countries. And that is primarily rent and labor, as well as utility. So when we got into the crisis, when we stressed this to government, we've got to help reduce these fixed costs. And some policies were introduced. They had to be improved. They are being improved, but still a ways to go there. And as we think about the recovery, got to think about that, those fundamental aspects of Canadian business, and maybe there's a chance in the big pivot to address them. We also need to appreciate how highly uneven. We talk about small business as kind of this homogenous group, but half of the job losses that are still out there are in accommodation and hospitality. It's restaurants, bars, and hotels, and the like. Another quarter, roughly, are in non-essential retail, and maybe an eighth more are in arts and entertainment. So we can say it's a small business crisis, but it is very over-indexed in those areas. And what this means is when we look at the recovery, and you've probably heard about this idea of a K-shaped recovery, that'll be flat for some, and then a dip and bounce back, so it kind of forms a K for others. That's what economic growth is starting to look like. It could be, if we're not careful, what the small business recovery looks like as well. It could be a nice, almost a V-shaped recovery for some small business and a flat line for others. And we need to appreciate the differentiation there. We also need to appreciate how this is impacting Canadians more broadly. We've just been digging into this. I get to oversee our economics team at RBC, and they've been doing some interesting work in the last couple of weeks on what's happening in the labor force. And we are seeing that, by and large, people making more than $800 a week are okay. So they're part of that K-shaped recovery. 1 million people who are off work in Canada right now were earning less than $800 a week. So the squeeze has been massively at the lower end of the income scale. And that makes sense when you think about how acute the crisis has been for hospitality, retail, and restaurants. Are we okay here? Hope the audio is okay. But there's opportunities out there. It's easy to look at these pictures and think this is challenging. We've also been studying consumption trends. And Canadians are spending more, as I mentioned. Through the summer, we spent more on golf, for instance. If you tried to get on a golf course this summer, you probably know the challenge. We're spending a lot more on streaming services. We're spending a lot more on home repairs. We're spending a lot more on food, but we're spending it differently. We've shifted, and the businesses that we're seeing that are starting to thrive are the ones that have shifted with those consumption trends. 64%, you probably saw the CFIB survey, but if you didn't, 64% of small businesses now are fully open, up from 20% in April. So that's part of this rebound, and those that are reopening and starting to grow again are the ones that are seizing on these consumer trends, and I'll talk about how we might think about going after those trends a bit differently. So what lies ahead? Well, the recovery is proving to be highly varied. It's going to be a little more K-shaped than B-shaped, meaning some firms are going to do really well. Manufacturing, food, technology, distribution and logistics, real estate, construction are all areas where we're starting to see some, and it's spotty, but we're starting to see some impressive growth. We'll see what winter brings, but the summer was better than we anticipated. Retail, restaurants, hospitality, less so, and not a lot of hope there in the immediate term. So when we think about that K-shaped recovery for small business, what are the factors we should be thinking through? And I'll lay out a few as context. Well, obviously, the biggest variable out there is the virus and the reopening. And while we're all hopeful, and the last couple of weeks before the Ontario re-lockdowns were introduced last weekend in parts of the province, many businesses were feeling good. They're thinking, okay, we got this. We can get through this. Not easy, but we can get through this. I think we're all starting to wonder, okay, we'll get through this, but it's going to be harder. It will be slower and spottier in terms of the reopening. We shouldn't be overwhelmingly confident that a vaccine is going to be rolled out with kind of universal access and efficacy in any time in the next few months. We're hoping the first half of 2021, but we've got some tough slogging in the months ahead. Secondly, we have to think about the global economy, and principally the US and China. China has been doing really well, really quite well, and we'll see how sustainable that is. But the US is also starting to show some spotty but impressive signs of recovery. If that can, then it'll be up and down, but if that can continue largely in an upward trajectory into 2021, which we think it will be, the next few months are going to be challenging, but then we may see an acceleration. The US and China will be critical to our own recovery. At the same time, all of us as employers are going to have to rethink our employment model, because that is not going to come back at the same speed as we're seeing the economy. Employees, by and large, don't want to go back to where all of us were 8 months ago. And this is raising productivity questions. And a lot more research needs to be done on that. But I sense a lot of employers, including probably many listening to this, are wrestling with, how am I going to get through this winter with my employees perhaps staying in a distributed environment? Do I have the technology? Do I have the productivity tools and the culture to drive the productivity when that acceleration comes at us, or when I need to manage costs? A couple of other factors of context to bear in mind are the government programs, which have continued, and we've been pushing governments to continue to stimulate the economy, but maintain liquidity, because businesses are suffering through zero fault of their own. This is not a business crisis. This is a macro global health crisis that has forced the shutting down of the economy. So we need to literally assist or build a bridge for business operators to get through the coming months. We also need to help those employees who may be furloughed for more months stay in place through enhanced EI. And we need to better address those fixed costs that I mentioned earlier, particularly rent, which I know is a critical challenge for small business across the country. More work to be done on that. But where are the opportunities? Because, as I said, we can become overwhelmed with the dark picture here. Let's remind ourselves, and I'll stress to this audience, that over the summer, about $30 billion more was put into household accounts in this country than was lost in payroll and employment income. That is largely the CERB surplus. So governments put more into the accounts of ordinary Canadians across the country than they lost from their paycheck. $30 billion more of extra cash is sitting out there. And while we're spending more, we're spending differently. And we haven't been spending $30 billion more. So the savings rate in the country is gone up remarkably. We see this in our own accounts. People are sitting on cash. How do we help those Canadians in every part of the country spend some of that money on Canadian business? I think that's one of the great challenges for 2021, and something we'll get into. And we've laid out some ideas in Small Business Big Pivot that I'll speak to here, and then throw it open to conversation. We need to continue to stress to Canadians, and this was a key message of our Big Pivot report, that small business is critical. It's not a nice to have, it is critical to the well-being of this country. It is the main job creator in this country. It is a huge driver of tax revenue, especially for local communities. As important as money, though, it is the backbone of communities across the country. You're the folks who are the spine of the communities that you're all part of in your region, not just as employers, but as citizens, as civic leaders. We see that across the country and can't say it enough. We need small business leaders to thrive so our communities can thrive. And then lastly, small business is critical to the demographic shifts that we've seen and are so positive for this country, but we've seen over the last quarter century. 25% of SMEs in this country are owned by foreign-born entrepreneurs. That is critical to the fabric as well as the economic growth of our country. So as we think about recovery and growth, we're going to need more immigration. We're going to need to get immigration back on track, but it's going to have to be, and not have to be, we want it to be entrepreneur immigration. So how do we pull and attract the world's most ambitious entrepreneurs to Canada, to York region, and ensure that they are creating businesses that can thrive and that we can all invest and spend on those businesses? But one of the most important things we need to think about out of this crisis, and the lesson of this crisis, is the digital pivot. In 2017, half of Canadian small and medium-sized enterprises did not have a website. Only 10% could process online payments. We are well behind, and you can see the comparisons in our report. We are well behind other countries. We're behind our competitors. So let's use this crisis as an opportunity. We've been stressing this to the Ontario government and have worked very ambitiously with the Ontario government, with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, as well as with the federal government, to invest in small and medium-sized enterprises and their digital capabilities. How do we help not just create the digital infrastructure for small business, but also get Canadians to continue to spend and buy more from Canadian business online? You may be familiar with the recent BDC study that was published this month that found 56% of consumers, more than half, bought more online in this country. And we see in our own work with consumers and products and services in our sector that after about 6 months of change, habits become hardwired with consumers. So what was kind of weird or novel or fresh in March, April, May is now really normal. We're seeing this in the bank, people doing mortgage applications and renewals and getting home equity loans on their phone, kind of normal. It's just like watching a Netflix film on your phone. Used to be novel, now it's a walk in the park. So all that you may have encountered with consumers over the last 6 months is the new normal. And if you are not doubling down on that, if you're not investing in the skills and technology and the relationships with your consumers, be sure others are. A really important report that I'm proud of that we've published and updated this fall looks at how COVID is changing, transforming the economy, and disrupting every business. Happy to circulate it with you. It looks at 8 trends of how we work, how we shop, how we watch, how we share, how we travel, how we learn, all having gone through kind of mini revolutions over the last number of months and becoming a new normal. And I want to touch on just a few before I wrap up with some thoughts on how we as a business community can seize on this. First of all is how we work. 75% of Canadians are comfortable working remotely and don't want to go back fully to where they were working before. We're seeing this as an employer of 55,000 Canadians. I asked my team of about 20 people about a month ago, how many of you want to come back this fall because I need to go through a process for that. Only one person put up their hand. I understand why, but I was impressed that is probably what most employers are going through or will go through over the next few months. that distributed nature of work is a new normal, and you have to turn that to a productive advantage, not a burden for you. Similarly, how we shop has become the new normal for all demographics through online shopping. Grocery shopping, just as an example, surged to 25% of food sales online in March. We thought that might be a high watermark. It actually went up to 33% through the summer, and it has stayed there. So we're anticipating that to be a new normal. How we watch is, and we're all familiar with this. I saw some interesting statistics overnight on the Stanley Cup. Viewership was down 61% this year. The NBA finals were down 49% from a year ago. And it's not like we're spending less time on screens watching things, we're spending more time. But our consumption of streaming, of Netflix, has gone way up. Gaming has gone up incredibly for people, especially for people under 35. Our time on social media has gone up in an extraordinary fashion. I saw a statistic recently that Canadian teens are spending on average 5 hours a day on social media. So we're watching, consuming, and sharing more than ever, but doing it very differently. And as a business, if you're not thinking about that sea change, not only others are, but your consumers are going to go out with that tide, and you may lose them. And all of this, how we watch, how we share, how we work, intersects with data. We are in the midst of a data revolution. And it's not so much about data, although data is the fuel of this. The revolution underway is a revolution in relevance. And we all have to ask ourselves, are we more relevant to our consumers today than we were 8 months ago? Do we even know that? And how do we know that? We should be, because with all this change and all these points of connectivity, we should all be more relevant to our consumers. But if we're not, you're going to be challenged. You're going to be challenged in all sorts of ways. And that's where the big pivot is so essential. Developing digital strategies, not for the sake of being digital, through this crisis, are fundamentally important to the prosperity of your organizations, because they will those digital strategies will give you the data that allows you to be more relevant to your consumers and will allow you to accelerate your growth. I've got to know a few amazing small Canadian businesses. I'll share a couple of stories with you over the last few months. One is an ice cream shop in Winnipeg, Chabon Ice Cream, that had to shut down because of distancing requirements. And I thought, okay, maybe this is lights out, until they had a brainstorming session and realized we can create a subscription model, sell subscriptions for ice cream. But wow, it's kind of a weird idea. And so you pay a monthly subscription, a bit like your Netflix subscription, and then you get to order the ice cream that you want, when you want it, however you want it. The revenue has actually gone up. They're selling more ice cream through subscriptions than they were through the store. Nixware, a great Toronto company, turned its annual warehouse event, which was scheduled for the depths of the crisis this spring, into an online event, and suddenly found most of their sales were going to the United States. They had never approached the American market, and now they are thriving, selling more than ever to American consumers. Soul Studio, a fitness studio in Vernon, BC, another one that you'd think would be lights out, created a virtual model and started to sell services to people around the world. Many of you are doing this, I'm sure, and we could go on and on with examples, but they're all examples of the big pivot. They speak to that great ingenuity of Canadian entrepreneurs. We don't need to tell you how to pivot. I mean, you're already pivoting. We've got to figure out how to help you pivot faster, better, and make sure that what you're pivoting to, you can accelerate out of. So let me wrap up with just a few thoughts of how we think we can help this big pivot, and would love to hear what you think we can do more of and push governments and other organizations to help with. Well, number one is the data and digital infrastructure that we need. We've got in this country, but we need to build it up understanding, we are in a platform economy, and we can't surrender ourselves so easily to the global platforms. We need to think about platforms within platforms for national networks and local networks. How do we help the businesses of your region thrive through your own platforms or networking into other platforms? How do we ensure that you have the digital and data infrastructure that you need to compete, not only within York region, but globally? Because as soon as you're into the platform economy, you're into a global economy. Secondly, how do we help you gain the skills and help your employees gain the skills that you need to excel in the platform economy? We think this is such a critical moment for Canadian colleges and universities to help employers and help employees develop the skills while we have a bit of time to develop the skills through micro-credentials so that your teams have the new skills that you need to excel in that platform economy. How do we promote ourselves through trade services to the rest of the world through that platform economy, knowing that we are going to be exporting services more than goods? Some of our best exports should be the brain power, should be the IP from York region. Sure, we'll be selling manufactured products as well, but most of the growth in the future for exports is going to be soft exports. It's knowledge, it's IP. How do we ensure we are promoting that for Team Canada to anyone in the world at any time? Fourthly, how do we help you on the home front? One of the things our CEO pushed, and we continue to push with governments, is the idea of targeted tax holidays to encourage Canadians to buy more locally. When we can reopen, how do we ensure that we've got tax incentives or whatever incentives are needed to get people signing up for the local fitness club or buying from the local butcher or signing up for local services? In order to take on the world, you got to be strong in your home market. We get that as a global company, so we want to find ways as we push this global strategy and platform strategy. We want to make sure that you're growing on your home front as well. And then lastly, how do we, in that spirit of Team Canada, start to think about 2021, when we think there will be a good recovery and an even better recovery going into 2022? How do we ensure that as Team Canada, we're supporting each other? How do we ensure that without violating international trade rules, that we've got more strategic procurement, so that us as individual consumers, but also us as businesses and governments, are buying from you and you're buying from us with that spirit of we're in this together as Canadians. But if we're going to build that properly, we've got to build it. We've got to build it together. So I hope this conversation can help with that. Let me wrap it up with that thought about not just building back better, but building back together. And would love to throw it open to questions and certainly hear your perspectives as well. So thank you again for sharing this time with me, but also with RBC.
Wow, John, thank you so much. That was an amazing tour of all the issues that are facing Canadian companies, and I know people have questions. So one of the first ones actually that came up on the chat was just whether we even have the infrastructure really in place. Are we ready to really support this big shift to digital? And perhaps anecdotally, by the way, with 3 kids home, 1 at university, 2 at high school, bandwidth becomes a highly sought after commodity, even within our household. So just your thoughts about where we sit with our digital infrastructure.
Yeah, we need, I think we need an urgent review of our digital infrastructure and need to think of it from a competitive positioning point of view. I find it almost ironic that one of the great political debates right before the crisis was about cell phone rates in the country. That's a great Canadian debate. And we need to shift that debate, and pricing is really important, but we need to ensure that whatever the pricing is, that we're expanding that capacity so that you're not fighting with your kids for bandwidth when you're trying to, if you're operating a business from the home and they're trying to do their homework, or they're trying to watch a local concert, which helps the local artists build their relevance, that you're not getting the spiral. So that's a really, really important part of the building back better. And one of the things I stress, or try to stress to governments, is that when we talk about digital infrastructure, and especially broadband, our minds tend to go to the far north and remote communities, and that's absolutely important. But remote can also be a 20-minute drive away from York Region. It can be in the Hockley Valley, where there's just a dip, or it can be in a building here in downtown Toronto, where there just isn't enough capacity to service the whole building or get through the walls. We're on the brink of a 5G revolution in this country. We got to get on with it and make sure that it's a 5G revolution that allows you as entrepreneurs to thrive, and all of us as consumers to help you do that. But infrastructure, let me just like broadband, critical, but it's also the skills that go with that, because we can have the best infrastructure in the world if we don't have the skills to help you format, structure your offerings at the speed of the consumer. It won't be optimal.
Right. A couple people are asking for links to the RBC reports that you've mentioned. So maybe if you could shoot those over after the session, that would be great, and we'll distribute them.
Absolutely. And I'll just say, if you go to rbc.com/thought leadership is one word, you'll find those reports, or just Google RBC and small business big pivot, and then the 8 trends report is also an easy Google search, but you'll also find it at the top of our thought leadership page. But we'll also share the links.
Okay, great. One of the questions I have for you is about our supply chain. So a lot of companies ran into big difficulties because of their reliance on supply chains external to the country. And perhaps more importantly, when it came down to critical supplies like N95 masks, we ran into big problems. Is there an opportunity, in your opinion, for Canadian small companies to redesign the supply chains and build that resilience so that we're not so dependent, let's say, on those external sources?
In certain sectors, absolutely, and I think that was a wake-up call for us, particularly on PPE and medical equipment, to a degree on pharmaceuticals and drugs. I think Canadians have the same concerns, and it's really amazing in some ways what a lot of manufacturers did this spring to create Canadian-produced PPE and medical equipment, including a number in New York Region. So hats off to all the people who made that and continue to make that happen. That's kind of a hero moment, I think, in some ways for the crisis for Canada. And we think there's an opportunity there for us, because I think in some ways Canadians realize, you know what, we can do it. We can, make stuff. We know this as well as anyone in the world, and we can do it at a reasonable cost, and we can do it especially when there is that that procurement, certainty of procurement. So coming out of this crisis, when I talked about sort of that strategic procurement for Team Canada, I think it's really important for governments to be more confident in saying, yes, we want to buy X next year and put it out to tender with with a preference for local suppliers, and be demanding of both quality and price. But I think we can meet those demands. Our competitors are going to be doing that as well. So if there's ways to help governments, because governments, in my experience, they often overthink things. They get nervous about trade violations, which I'm not trying to be facetious about, but sometimes I think they just overthink it. And in this crisis, they realize, we don't have time to overthink this. We just got to do it. So how do we take that kind of get it done attitude into the recovery? And I think you can help genuinely. You can help governments kind of get over themselves and just get on with it. And we need to help with that as well, and making it a little more acceptable, giving them air cover, for instance, to do this. Many of our public institutions also need to review their procurement strategies. Hospitals, as we know in this province, are really hard to sell to. I hear this from entrepreneurs all the time. I find it much easier to sell to a U.S. hospital than an Ontario hospital. That's kind of bonkers. So how do we kind of get over that? So those are critical kind of retoolings that we can do for the recovery. But we also have to be really mindful of the power of scale. And Canada does not have the scale that we need to really compete in the long term. And we have an opportunity coming out of this crisis as the U.S. rethinks its own supply chains as well, to ensure it's not only an opportunity, it is a damn important challenge for us to ensure that we are as integrated with the U.S. supply chains as ever, and perhaps even more so. That's our ticket to scale, the U.S. market. We've got to sell to other parts of the world, absolutely, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that the U.S. is our 10x multiplier. So let's not allow breakages in that supply chain. Let's ensure that the border does not remain closed in any sort of lasting way. We've got to keep commerce flowing across the border so that those North American supply chains remain healthy, and that will be good for us.
Great. I wanted to just ask our other panelists if you had some questions. I know Chris Carter's here, Deanna Petrini. If you had some questions for John, I'm inviting you to jump in before I monopolize his time with all my questions.
Sure. Hey, John, it's Chris Carter here from Schulich School of Business in York University. I just wanted to ask you a question about where reskilling comes in and what you think we do related to the workers that are working in a lot of these industries that have been affected. Many of the businesses will go digital, but they might need less staff. So what do you think the opportunity is to try and also do a big pivot on the workforce?
Yeah, no, this is such a profound question, Chris. And I think York Region, with York University particularly, but also great community colleges right through the GTA and beyond. We have an opportunity, and we're trying to lead this through a group called the Business Higher Education Roundtable, which is a coalition of employers and educators, pushing work-integrated learning, co-ops, internships, apprenticeships. And that's something we've been pushing for the last 4 or 5 years and making good progress across the country on that. But in addition to those work placements for students, because we think work experience is a critical part of the post-secondary education, we need to pivot or help educators pivot in this crisis to offer, call it micro-credentials, but that I think tag becomes too limiting. That helps educators offer real-time consumer-facing or employee-facing education through mobile channels, so that employees who are working or maybe on EI, not maybe, those on EI should be doing this, can be developing the skills they need to shift to where the new jobs are. So where are those jobs going to be? So a typical restaurant, for instance, may need fewer people, or a retailer is going to need fewer people. how do you help someone pivot to become a data analyst for Amazon, for instance, or for Shopify, a great Canadian company? That's not easy, but it's not out of the realm of the possible either, because we see this across the economy. We had a session with Ginny Rometty, who recently stepped down as CEO of IBM globally, who has pushed this idea of skills over credentials. And she demanded out of IBM half a decade ago that jobs be filled based on skills, not the credentials they've got. And something like 50% of the new jobs at IBM have been filled by people who may not have had the credentials. And these are for finance and tech jobs primarily. IBM is teaching them the skills that they need for those jobs. So they're hiring people with those aptitudes. And this is really a pivot for Canadians to think, that laid off or furloughed retail worker actually has the aptitude maybe to be a data analyst, but needs 6 months or of intense training and maybe 12 further months of part-time training beyond that. How do we ensure that an employer who's picking them up is able to connect with an educator who can do this? Because it's employer, educator, employee who are in this together. This is a new frontier for us, and if I can maybe make a suggestion to this group and let us know how we can help. We think there's a real need for pilot projects on this across the country. And I know the Ontario government is really interested in this, as is the federal government. If the employers and educators of York Region, for instance, wanted to, and maybe you're already doing this, create a pilot project that helped people transition from jobs that are going away to jobs that are growing in demand. Let's help create that in York Region and make you a model for the country and maybe the world in this great in this great transition. Because what we see through economic cycles and through history is that technology always leads to more jobs, not less. Just leads to different jobs. And we're seeing this now in the economy, where, remember I mentioned at the beginning, like employment for people at the upper end is growing. We're struggling to fill jobs, those tech jobs, for instance, as tech companies are hiring and hiring. So that's not an easy transition, but that's typical of the sort of tech revolution that we're in the midst of. So how do we create those transition models and learn as we do it?
We've got a question that's been submitted. The challenge around convincing consumers to shop local versus Amazon is usually the price difference, and I think typically also is the speed of delivery. And so what advice do you have for businesses in terms of differentiating themselves in this very, very hyper competitive online market?
Yeah, speed of delivery is fascinating, and Amazon can be terrific for Canadian producers. I'm not against Amazon per se. I just want to make sure that Canadian businesses are thriving, be it on Amazon or Shopify or whatever other platforms come out of this, and ensure that the money that we're all saving, that we've squirreled away and we'll start to spend. And we're pushing this to governments. How do we ensure that more of that money is captured locally? Because there's a great crisis that a great risk that we get stimulus and we buy imported goods, and 80 or 90% of the money flows offshore. Speed and price point often drive those things. So there are tax incentives that can help on that price differential. But I think it's really important for businesses, and here's where data can help, understand that your consumer may want speed and demand speed, and that's that new point of relevance. And you've got to think about the speed of the consumer. It's not easy, but start to deliver things at their speed and not at your speed. Again, not easy, but business is never easy, right? And that's why many people go into business. They love the challenge, and this is an epic challenge. But we have the tools to deliver the services faster, faster and better? And then how do we give you a bit more air cover to help kind of bake into Canadian minds that, yeah, I like buying locally. I actually get the benefit to my community, to my neighbors, and that flows back to me. So there's a lot of messaging there that I think we can continue to invest in.
Just to build on that, the Canada United campaign that the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and RBC and many others joined was highly successful. And we had the president of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce actually part of one of our series sessions and said that they had exceeded the goal long before the target date of the money raised. And so what are your thoughts about that type of approach? It's not, government grants and it's not, stimulus, but it's really inspiring the community to shop local and keeping, those investments within the community.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we need to learn from that and continue to take those approaches, because as I mentioned earlier, you folks, you're the entrepreneurs. You know how to create opportunities, and you know how to sell. We just have to create that platform and the ease for, and even sometimes the incentives for consumers. So that can be some tax incentives, but it can also be rewards and loyalty, which we know Canadians love. So how do we ensure that, in loyalty programs, for instance, that we're creating those incentives for Canadians, especially when we come out of winter and start to spend more, ensure that a better share of that spend is captured locally.
Do you foresee, you touched on trade a couple times in terms of trying to prioritize local in terms of procurement, but recognizing that we are part of trade agreements. And then, do you anticipate these being big battles to move this forward, or similar to the European countries taking on big tech to get them to actually collect their taxes in the country of origin? Where do you see those fights happening, and how do we as Canadians ensure our voices are heard?
Yeah, it's hard. We're shrinking in size relative to the rest of the world. That's just basic math. We have the best set of trade relationships in the world. We have access to the European market, extraordinary access to the U.S. and Mexican markets, and better and better access to Asian markets. So our challenge is to ensure that we are activating those, and that's one of the challenges, to get more Canadians to sell globally. I think this crisis may be a gift on that front, because I think a lot of people felt they had to get on a plane and fly to China or fly to Dallas to sell, and now you don't need to go anywhere to sell, which was also true a year ago. But I think we're all just really, really comfortable now selling and buying from whoever, wherever, whenever. So let's develop that mindset that, when you woke up this morning, your addressable market was 8 billion people, and your competitors also woke up to an addressable market of 8 billion people. So we should all feel a bit of a fire under our feet on that. But your question about trade agreements is also important. We think we can promote local purchasing without violating our trade agreements. Our trade partners do that. They're more ambitious about it, and sometimes a bit more aggressive about it. Well, we've got to kind of take that a bit more of an elbows up approach on it, and also understand, like, we're small, so we're maybe we can we're not a threat to people, but we also need to appreciate that the world is not going to go back to a multilateral trading, open trading system. It's not that we've moved away from it. That would be an overstatement. But it's going to be more contentious, we think, in the years ahead. But again, back to the point about the U.S. being, the best market in the world, let's continue to make sure we have the best access to it. But I think we can do that and also procure strategically and support each other without being offside.
Great. There was a question earlier that I overlooked, so I apologize to, I think it's Mike that asked it. The just-in-time inventory model breaks down under these conditions. And so the question was, how do we move past that? And anecdotally, I know landscapers were doing great business this summer, but we're starting to hear about material shortages, lumber and stone as we work through the inventory. What are your thoughts about this inventory? I guess that was a sensitive question.
No, it's a great question, and we are seeing a tightening up of lumber supplies. I didn't know about stone, but that makes sense, and I think the crisis made us all aware of the just-in-time economy and how we come to take it for granted. It should level off. I mean, we've gone through like the last 7 months, and especially the first few months of that. We're extraordinary. We're not going to have, God forbid, anything like that again, at least not for the foreseeable future. But there's going to be a lumpy and bumpy recovery. So you've all learned to manage that through the summer. We'll probably see a bit more stockpiling, especially in those hard inventory areas. But it will start. The market will take care of that to a certain extent. But we just need to. And back to sort of the point I made at the beginning about the low margins of small business is something for us to be really mindful of, because it's hard to run inventories when you've got such tight margins and light liquidity. So there's no magic answer there. But I don't think it's a crisis. There will be pinch points, but I don't think it's a macro crisis over the medium term.
Okay, that is great. It has been wonderful to speak with you, John, and to have this type of a conversation. It's reassuring, honestly, to get that bigger viewpoint when you're in the trenches day to day. I wanted to just point out for our attendees that with regards to this big pivot to digital, on October 29th, we're actually hosting the Digital Main Street folks to talk about that program. And Chris, I saw you posted something on the chat as well, that your students, your entrepreneurs are having tremendous success working with local businesses with that program. So I would encourage everybody to check that out. And previously we touched on the Trade Accelerator program that Toronto Global is doing with the Toronto Region Board of Trade with funding from the federal and provincial government, which is exactly the program to help companies get the expertise they need to export. So check it out. If you want to find out, you can see the previous recordings on those sessions or come and join us for the 29th. This has been fantastic. I want to thank John for sharing your time and expertise with us, and to all the partners and to the attendees for joining. This has been an amazing session. Thank you so much, everybody. We will be sending out the link to the recording. So I was taking notes, but I'm definitely going to want to go back and process some of this again. So thanks again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. See you next time.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.